You're listening to Jargon Free Radio, brought to you by Little Voice Media, the video and audio specialists.
Hi, it's Steve B here again, Jargon Free Radio. Once again, the month's rolled round. Sorry about that. We're out on the road this month. We're not in our usual studio in London. We're actually over in the Houses of Parliament, down by the river there, if you know where that is. And we're lucky enough, I think, today to have as our guest Greg McClymont, who's you'll probably know, Labour Shadow Pensions Minister. Greg, wonderful for you to join us here. Thank you.
Afternoon, Steve. Welcome to House of Commons.
Now, we've not met, have we? I mean, well, I know we've met now. We met just now when we came into the room here. But I've met loads of MPs and pensions ministers and shadow pensions ministers over the years. But I do think you really are the first one that I've ever met on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like we know each other very well, Steve, from our Twitter exchanges. That happens more and more, I find, these days.
Well, it's amazing, really, isn't it? I mean, a few years ago, I didn't even know what Twitter was, and then somebody said to me, "You should do this," and here we are meeting. We've been exchanging tweets and retweeting tweets and things for a few weeks or months now, and that's how we got to invite you onto the show. But I mean, I suppose just to kick off, is that something you see as part of kind of the role of or maybe a minister, which you could be after the next election?
I mean, I think Twitter has a role to play, especially as a place where you can gather information and be introduced to people and their views that you might otherwise not come across. So the pensions community is a large community in the UK with a number of different interests and many viewpoints, and Twitter's as good a place as any to come across many of those views. Doesn't replace face-to-face meetings, and really the first 6 to 9 months in the brief I spent almost exclusively on meeting as many stakeholders as possible across the pensions industry. But I think Twitter, as an addition to that, has a role to play.
And how, well, that's interesting, this process you've been through. I mean, if you're a minister or shadow minister, you're dropped into a brief and then you've got to find out all about it. Our pension system is bewilderingly complex, isn't it? You've been involved long enough now, I suppose, that you'll have your own view on that. I mean, people will know that I've been against the complexity of pensions for a long time, and in fact a large number of us in the industry have. But I've changed my view a bit on that, in that these days I kind of think it doesn't matter if you have a complex pension system as long as it does the right thing by people. If you've got a complex system that you can't understand, I think that's all right, as long as it can't do you any harm, I suppose. I don't know what your views on that kind of thing would be. Do you need simplicity if it's not dangerous, if you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the order of things, the worst possible outcome is a complex system that no one understands and is damaging.
No, that's where I think we've come from.
Yeah. And the best possible outcome is a straightforward system that people understand and that delivers for them. And I mean, you're right about coming into a brief. You're newly placed in that role, and actually in an area like pensions, you really have to spend a significant amount of time just meeting with people and reading up on the subject to get a handle on it. And really, I think I've been in post now a year, and the first 6 months in particular was really alongside meeting people to gain information. It was about reading as widely as possible, deciding what the priorities were and moving on from then. And the publication several months back of Labour's policy review document on pensions people can trust, is really the culmination of that process.
I wonder, could you summarise that briefly?
Yes, Pensions People Can Trust, published by the Labour Party, calls for both short and longer term action. In the short term, full disclosure of all costs and charges which people are paying for their pension, including transaction costs, and a straightforward way of disclosing the total expenses ratio. So not just the annual management charge. Alongside that, other what we describe as potential rip-offs, active member discounts, more appropriately called deferred member penalties, exit fees, and sorting out the small pots issue. That would be kind of short-term things that really need to happen. And I think there's some movement in that.
You're pretty much aligned with Steve Webb on that.
Well, that's an interesting question. Steve Webb has said that he's watching pension charges like a hawk, referring, I think, in particular to the old legacy style. fees, but actually he can't watch pension charges like a hawk because he hasn't put in place a comprehensive disclosure regime. How are you able to compare the total costs and charges of one scheme to another when you don't have that
well, especially when there are so many different structures.
Exactly.
Well,
so I don't think he can do that. And on small pots, I think the government is in the wrong place on pot follows member. I just don't think that policy is going to work, given the structure as we stand with exit fees and deferred member penalties and so on. You're in danger of people changing job a dozen times in their career, moving from a pension scheme into another one, hit with charges up front, hit with exit penalties, and it's often, I guess, been moved into schemes which aren't as good as the ones they were in.
No, that could happen. So on this idea that pensions these days should be magnetic in some way, if I can summarise it, the public argument or debate is that they should either be magnetised to the person, or as the person leaves, they should be magnetised into one big lump together. Is it? You're in favour of all pensions being magnetised into one?
First of all, I think we
lump.
should call them a default rather than automatic, because there may be cases where people don't want to move their pension.
Quite.
And I think you need a system that combines aggregators with, if people wish,
with choice.
With pot to follow member. So I think the debate's not in the right place, and I don't think the government got itself in the right place from the start off on this, and it's a big issue. So that's kind of short to medium term policy proposals. Also, the issue of trustees. I mean, my own view is that there should be trustees for every scheme. Of all the ways to administer a pension scheme and ensure people get the best deal, I think trustees for all schemes is important.
And you'd include professional trustees? You'd require that? I mean, I've always thought professional trustees are kind of a must as well.
Certainly independent trustees, and I think related to that, to make that viable and work very well, I think you need to reduce the number of pension schemes in the UK.
But we're just about to increase the number of pension schemes. I mean, I was talking to somebody from Holland or Netherlands the other day, and they've got a small number of very large schemes. Here, after auto-enrolment, we're going to end up with a very large number of small schemes. We're going the opposite way to that, aren't we? We're actually going to have a proliferation of schemes, and what interests me is how those small schemes themselves can be aggregated together and have a level of independence. Those things must be possible in this age where we have such powerful computing facilities at our disposal.
Jargon Free Radio with pension guru Steve B.
It seems to me that you've come into pensions at quite an interesting time. We're at the end of a 50-year experiment where the state's been in the business of providing a second pension, an earnings-related pension, through the DWP these days. Today it's called S2P. It used to be called SERPS before that, and when it first started in the early 1960s, it was called the Graduated Pension Scheme. But it's a really weird thing that we've had our basic state pension, our company pension system on top of that, but where employers didn't provide a good enough company pension, then the state itself said, well, we'll provide that. And that's been done. What the state's done at a macro level for the employers of 13 million people today, at a macro level for half a century, provided a pension scheme through the national insurance system, put the right people into it, made sure the wrong people didn't go into it, and draw money weekly or monthly from employers and employees and make sure that money is at least allocated to that account, even though it's not a funded scheme, it doesn't really matter. What the state's done that on a macro level for half a century now, longer than many people at work have been on the planet, let alone at work. In the future, after these reforms wash through over the next few years, 5 years or so, each employer in the country has got to do at a micro level within their business what the state's been doing for them on a macro level up to them. They've got to have a pension scheme, got to populate it with the right people, not populate it with the wrong people, and make sure that they put the right contributions in, this time real contributions into a funded scheme. That's a massive change. That's a big switch in public policy. Now, that was brought in by Gordon Brown's government towards the end of the last government's term, the 2007-2008 Pensions Acts. It's been heavily endorsed by the new coalition government that we currently have. My guess is that come 2015, when we will have a new government after that, it may be another coalition government, it may be a different type of coalition government, it might be a Conservative government, it might be a Labour government. But I'd see the continuation of that policy because of the recent history, the fact that it's introduced by Labour and endorsed by the current government. Is that the way you see that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting take, that, looking at it in the longer term and over the longer term. I mean, I think the Turner Consensus was an important development. I can speak for myself and for my party in saying that workplace pensions are very, very important. It seems to me that workplace pensions are where the action is. And you're right, it is a radical shift, but we have to make it work, which is why I've been saying with such urgency that you have to get the offer to employers, and particularly for the small and medium-sized employers coming down the line in auto-enrolment staging, they have to be getting good offers, because we go back to the initial point about complexity. Unless there's straightforward, low-cost, transparent pricing, small and medium-sized enterprises will struggle.
Yeah,
they don't have the muscle and they don't have the expertise
or the time. They're trying to run a business.
Yeah, and of course, and that's
they don't want to be pensions experts.
Exactly, and that's not to be underestimated. So we really have to. And so I think there's broad agreement that it has to work, and the broad agreement it has to work. Workplace pensions comes, I think, from that recognition, which everyone who's involved in the pensions world knows, that we're neither saving enough as a whole, nor as individuals. And there's more than half in the private sector who've got no pension provision whatsoever. And if that situation does not change radically, then in the end it's the state, as the taxpayers, who will be left having to support in one way or another people in retirement who are in poverty. And that's...
Now, when you said earlier the worst outcome would be something that was complex, that was also acted against you, not your exact words, but that's kind of what we were talking about there. We've come from a position where means-tested support for the old. I think Frank Field wrote something in The Sun just last week. I read that where he was saying that means testing was a real problem. I mean, it's clearly a disincentive to save. Where people do the right thing and save for a pension, they're doing the right thing not just by themselves, are they? They're doing the right thing by everybody else too, all of us, the state, whatever, that is all of us. It's not a separate thing, that's us. And the system itself, I think, has to do right by them. Mm-hmm. Where you save for a pension and you find that £1 that you've saved isn't worth £1 because of the marginal deduction rates, because of that clearly is unfair. The best way out of that, and the course that Steve Webb is currently following, is that we would have a decent subsistence level basic pension, just what Beveridge wanted but never really did achieve for a long period of time. But £140 a week, that seems to me to do the trick. But it needs to be permanent, I think. That it's all very well saying to people it's safe to save at the moment, but how can they know that in 40 years' time, when they reach retirement age, things haven't deteriorated again? We've got means testing rife across the system and their savings are eroded in value, that kind of thing. People are talking these days about guarantees because of annuity rates and things like that. It seems to me a more fundamental guarantee ought to be there, that the system itself won't ever act against people who do the right thing. That's
I'm
kind
sure
of what Frank Field was saying. Is that your party's view?
And this is where some of the complexity comes in, because my understanding is Frank Field is a great critic of the proposal for a single-tier flat-rate state pension, because, again, my understanding is from listening to Frank ask questions in the Commons about this and speak about it, because it will penalise those who have saved.
Yeah, he's very much for the contributory principle to be reintroduced.
And he's concerned about those that have saved, on the understanding that they will get, significantly more than those who have only saved the basic minimum. And this is where the complexities become, because, as you say, Frank Field, on that reading, would be a great supporter of the single-tier state pension. He's actually very, very concerned about it. And I think the issue will be about those people, the losers. The argument for simplicity is clear. The Labour government was moving down the route, the path that the government's gone down, but over a much longer period of time, because of these issues of fairness and cliff edges. So I think the detail is going to be absolutely critical. How do the government do this, if indeed they do propose to do it? Steve Webb recently said that the government paper will no longer be a white paper; it will be minty coloured.
Minty green.
Yeah, someone said on Twitter, minty's the new white, and I suggested it's actually the old green. Yeah. So the detail is very important in ending that uncertainty. But on your broader point, Steve, about certainty for savers, absolutely. That's kind of where Frank Field's coming from in terms of saying these people that have saved over all these years to get a bigger second pension did so in the understanding that
they would get it.
They would get it, and now it looks like they might not. So, I mean, there's trade-offs here. There's trade-offs, of course, as there always is in public policy, but getting simplicity and clarity and setting it above the means test, seems like a very sensible way to proceed. But the detail and how you compensate the losers from this proposal is absolutely key.
Jargon Free Radio with pension guru Steve B.
Yeah, I do think we've taken some big steps in the last few decades. It's no longer dangerous to be in a company pension scheme. Yeah. They run quite thin ice once.
Yeah. PPF, a great thing that the Labour government did.
I agree with that. I think it's the most significant thing that's been done in our pension system for the last 20 years. It's a shame it took so long, but we have it now. Yeah. I don't think people realise what position they were in with pension schemes. They weren't as secure as people thought. But now they are, so we've got all the security. Those kinds of schemes, unfortunately, are going, but that doesn't matter. If an employer pays the same money in, I don't think it matters what pension scheme. One thing that does bother me and people like me is that as employers switch from that type of pension scheme, the old-fashioned final salary scheme, as we used to call it, switch to money purchase, I don't go along with the demonisation of DC. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. If the employer puts 20% into a DC scheme or 20% into a final salary scheme, DB scheme, broadly speaking, the outputs will be the same. But they don't, do they? As employers switch, they have a tendency to reduce their... it's not just pushing the risks onto employees, the risk of mortality and investment, but they also reduce the contributions, which I think has a far more damaging effect than any of the other.
That's a really interesting point about separating out the model from the contribution, because we know that the greatest reason to save in a pension rather than any other form of long-term saving is the employer contribution.
Absolutely.
So I absolutely agree about the employer contribution being critical. Interesting what you say about DC. I mean, my worry is about individual DC as it stands, and the fact that you don't have those economies of scale, that you can't, it's just your pension pot and it's invested in your behalf.
Well, I did a tweet on that, which you may know about, because it was one of my tweets that went everywhere, where I made the simple point, I think, that pensions are a bit like grapes, that it's much more efficient to sell them in bunches.
Yeah.
If Tesco's barcoded every grape, nightmare, you'd have queues a mile long.
And as you said, your quote as well about the Dutch system, that was a very elegant line about, in the Netherlands they have few pension schemes with lots of people in them. In the UK we have lots of pension schemes with few in them. I don't think that scale issue can be, I say, coming from the outside, the thing that struck me once I had absorbed a significant amount of information about the landscape was how fragmented the UK pensions landscape is. That's the thing that really stands out.
Yeah. No, that's not easy to fix, but it is possible, I think. Given that we've made this decision to move from state provision of a second pension to employers having duties laid on them to do that, we've moved to that position, then I suppose we ought to be looking, shouldn't we, in this computer age, of accumulating those small schemes into larger groups where economies of scale might work.
And the NEPF, of course, I was there last week, as I'm sure you were yourself, and I mean, the NEPF's kind of led in a lot of this stuff, and it's scale plus alignment. I mean, it has to be alignment as well. There's no point trying to regulate a system where the market incentives lie in the direction other from the one which public policy demands. You have to get the alignment of the market correct. So, example, on scale, we should be looking at a situation where giving incentives to scale up, saying if there's a scaling up process, that might enable some regulations to be removed.
All right.
Because you have these high quality, low cost, transparent schemes, and some of the regulation that's in place, to make sure those things happen, might not be necessary if you have those kind of schemes in place. I think scale is in the longer term is going to be very important.
Well, that's I could go on with it. I've found this very interesting, I have to say. Our 20 minutes has flown by.
It certainly has.
Rob here, who does the recording, and everybody listening knows who Rob is because he's mentioned in every programme. He's looking furiously at me, so we've got to stop. But I wonder if this might just be the first of a number of conversations we'll have on Jargon Free Radio, maybe over the next few years. If you remain involved, and I know people move on in this kind of thing, but it would be a waste of your year's induction if you were to leave us so soon. So maybe we can come back and continue with this discussion
Delighted
later
to,
on.
Steve. Welcome back anytime.
Right, excellent.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming along. Thanks.
You've been listening to Jargon Free Radio, brought to you by Little Voice Media, the video and audio specialists.